Over the days following the incident that left Ted Braden fighting for his life, with his mind still seemingly absent from his ruined body, I had grown more paranoid than ever. The only time I would leave my house was during my daily visits to the hospital, often crying at the bedside of the friend I damned to this fate. While my home didn't exactly feel as secure as it once did, between paintings hanging themselves on the walls and unsettling individuals letting themselves in to await my return, I still felt somewhat safe there. From what I could tell, the lodge seemed unable to transform my door into one that would lead into the horrors within its walls. I didn't have any concrete proof of that fact, other than it sending its emissaries to invite me to enter. Were it able to trick me as it had the absent Firenze Jones, I imagine it wouldn't feel the need to jump through so many hoops. There's no sense in bringing in some creepy old ambassador if it could just push me unwillingly across the threshold. Yes, this was all just a theory at best. I couldn't conceive of any rules to this madness other than the facts with which I was presented. The old man said it was interested in me, whatever the hell that means. Perhaps whatever this interest involves requires that I be a willing participant. Suffice it to say, if I do have to enter of my own volition, that fucking building is going to have a long-ass wait. No, if it wants me, it'll have to drag me kicking and screaming, like a toddler on crack being forced to head to the dentist. Yeah, not my most clever analogy, but my mindset isn't exactly what it used to be, all things considered. My isolation continued for several more days after that night, aside from those visitations to see my friend. Though the doctor said that physically he was out of the woods, a phrase that still causes me to tense up from head to toe, he was yet to awaken from his coma. As much as I wished so much to see his eyes blink back to awareness, I couldn't help but think it may be best if he sleeps through the recovery from his many injuries. However things work out, should he ever come out of it, he was looking to have a great deal of physical therapy to endure. One other venture I worked on over the time in voluntary solitude was to rid myself of that damned painting, as well as the book the old man sent to my P.O. box. I decided that burning them would be the most thorough way to go, tossing the book into my fireplace, squirting some lighter fluid across it, and lighting it up before carrying the painting out back. The frame was far more sturdy than I anticipated, making it no easy task to free the canvas from his grip. My trusty firewood axe made quick work of it though, chopping it down into veritably bite-sized chunks in a matter of minutes. With the frame in pieces and the painting free to tear apart, I tossed all of it into my fireplace, in which the book still crackled when I re-entered my home. Though my brooding would be unlikely to subside anytime soon, I can't even describe the sensation of watching the artifacts of the lodge slowly turning to ash before me. When only that soot remained, I scooped it up, tipped it into a trash bag, and took a drive to truly lay them to rest. Yeah, I could have just dumped it in the garbage, but I didn't even want the slightest remnants lingering in my home, should I ever be able to see it as my sanctuary again. I made certain that my fireplace was spotless by the time I headed out, leaving not the slightest stain of that damned building in my house. Again, I could have easily deposited the bag at the local waste dump, or even some random gas station trash can, but I wasn't taking any chances. I drove for a good hour, seeking out the most secluded old boneyard I could find, burying the sack of ash in what I hoped to be consecrated ground. Maybe it's just the curse of the mystery writer to see every possible angle in which the lodge could still reach me through the dust, but I had to know that I had covered every possibility I could. Though I was exhausted and filthy by the time I returned to my home, the many miles traveled and physical exertion of digging as deeply as I could having taken its toll on my very out-of-shape body, I felt so much lighter when I stepped under the flowing hot water of my shower. I knew that I wasn't yet free of that sinister building, nor was I likely to be any time soon, but this felt like a satisfactory first step. I couldn't know what its next move would be, in its efforts to lure me in, but I was prepared to fight if it came to that. When I heard the knocking on my front door, just as I cut the water off and wrapped a towel around me, that brief moment of comfort swiftly transitioned to stiffened muscles and a twitch at the base of my neck. I tried to ignore the repetitive pounding on the entrance to my home, drying myself off and tossing on some clean clothes, sneaking into my bedroom, barely making a sound. It was late evening by this point, but I still fought to rationalize that it could be nothing more than a neighbor potentially requesting a cup of sugar or some other quite unlikely scenario. A good 15 minutes later, while the relentless knocking continued, I was having a much harder time convincing myself that it was just some innocent bystander requesting my attention at this hour. After another 20 minutes or so, with the persistent visitor still gently rapping at my chamber door, I reluctantly crept back downstairs, hopeful that I could remain silent while gazing through my peephole. I felt a heavy exhale pass my lips when my eyes met those of the taller of the Abernathy boys, who had cornered me at the Blue Moon what felt like years ago by this point. Though my vision was quite restricted through the tiny spyglass, I saw no trace of the other brother, only the lone individual. On top of that, the dark-haired man appeared far more frazzled than he had when we first met. At that time, the both of them came off unnervingly calm and gentle, which was strangely more unsettling than if they had barked demands at me. He was cutting his head from side to side, glancing over his shoulder and visibly shivering as he continued to bump his fist against my door. He was obviously nervous about something, potentially afraid even. Whether it was just how exhausted my body and mind had grown through this seemingly endless ordeal, or just that I almost felt bad for the guy for one reason or another, I was inclined to let him in, if for no other reason than to hear what he had to say. All I knew was that Mr. Thatch, the former owner of the pleasant back-alley bookshop, an emissary of the lodge, or the powers behind it, had been trying to avoid the Abernathy brothers. With my desire to distance myself as much as I could from that damned place, or anyone in its employment, I was compelled to consider that old adage: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Yes, this particular enemy of my enemy was at least an arsonist, having gone to such extremes to wipe out the bookshop. I can't deny that I had my suspicions that they were responsible for the death of Randolph Jones as well, but I had nothing concrete on which to base that theory. Still, whether this man had blood on his hands or not, it was clear to me that he was no friend to the lodge. Even with everything I had endured since learning of that sinister building, as crazy as it sounds to even consider a building having nefarious intent, I still wanted answers. With all of this attacking my mind like an oncoming storm as I gazed through the peephole, with the dark-haired man still tapping his request to be granted entry, I felt my fingers wrapping around the knob before I even realized it. With another heavy sigh and gritted teeth, I flipped my deadbolt latch and hesitantly pulled the door ajar. "I need your help," the man said, the second my eyes met his. With no borders between us now, I could see the fear in his gaze, the disheveled and untucked navy blue button-down shirt and messy hair, a far cry from how pristine and proper he looked the first time we met. Without a word, I gestured for him to come inside, glancing out into the night to be sure that no other unwelcome guests were nearby. I closed and locked the door once more when I was certain everything looked clear. "Beer?" I asked, studying the man who still trembled in my living room. Yes," he said, hesitantly taking a seat on my couch. I would very much appreciate that." "I'll be right back," I said after fishing us both a chilled brew, walking away to grab my robe. I can't say why I felt secure in the knowledge that he wasn't up to something, having entered my home under false pretenses, awaiting my guard to drop so he could strike. But he seemed so much more harmless and far less intimidating than our last meeting, coming off more like a wounded puppy than some madman with an agenda. Maybe I simply didn't care anymore, the lodge having taken its toll on my wavering sanity. Either way, I genuinely saw no harm in allowing the guy a few minutes to settle down a bit, hopefully growing calm enough to confidently let me in on what he hoped I could help him with. When I arrived back in my living room, taking my chair across from the couch and taking that first refreshing sip of my beer, I just glared at the guy. I still didn't speak, as I simply hadn't figured out what to say. I just waited in silence for him to say what he had to say, before deciding whether or not I would send him packing. "My brother is missing," he said, the bottle still trembling in his hand. "For how long?" I asked. "Only a day, but that isn't his way. He is not one to wander off." "One day isn't missing," I said, yawning and rubbing my eyes. Well, there isn't any reason to get all freaked out. Are you sure? This isn't like him, he snapped, almost inspiring me to drop my bottle. He would not leave without telling me. They've taken him. Of that I am certain. They? Like the lodge, they? Yes. Yes, the lodge and its servants. Its captives. Its prisoners. Why would they want to? Because we are trying to stop it. To end it. To wipe its stain from this world. Do you really think that burning down a bookshop and snuffing out an old man is really going to put a dent in that damn place? I said coldly, sitting my beer on the table. The shop was only one of many that was a friend to the lodge. But what old man? The shop owner survived. He seems to think us unaware of that fact, but Randolph Jones? Does that name sound familiar? Randolph? Yes, the brother of one Firenze Jones, yes? We have planned to reach out to him, but he's dead? Do you really expect me to believe that you guys had nothing to do with that? Why would we remove him from the board? He asked, looking genuinely perplexed. His only brother was abducted as well. He would only be a friend to our cause. I hadn't even thought about this when I assumed that these two were responsible for the murder. I suppose I hadn't fully considered their reasoning behind wiping out the bookstore as well, that it was to take a stab at the foundation of the lodge itself. Maybe I just thought of these brothers as some sort of madmen, or even more emissaries of the building itself, staging some kind of play to rope me in even more. A yin and yang of sorts, with one side pulling and the other pushing, leading me closer and closer to giving myself to the place. The more these thoughts rattled around in my scattered brain, the more it all made sense to me. What lengths would I be willing to go to if I was pushed to that point? Would I be driven to burn shops to their foundations to free myself from its grasp? When I looked back up to meet the eyes of the desperate man perched on my couch, I no longer saw malicious intent in his gaze, but that same fear I've seen looking back at me from the mirror these past weeks. "Will you help me?" he asked with wide and glassy eyes. It was no simple request, not for one hoping to escape the tendrils of the lodge. That being said, I now saw a kindred spirit in this man, whether or not I decided to lend him a hand just yet. "How did you learn of the lodge?" I asked, almost nervous of what he might reveal. "What, or who did it take from you?" He just glared at me with wide eyes and a trembling lower lip before cutting his gaze down to the beer bottle he held. "Everything. Everyone. Now it has taken everyone." When the tears began to drip from his tilted face, falling to his lap and the bottle in his hand, I no longer saw a strangely intimidating and mysterious man, but a fellow wounded soul who looked to have witnessed far more than I had. We talked a good deal more that night, with me describing everything I had encountered since Firenze Jones spoke of the lodge, what feels like years ago by this point. Reginald Abernathy, or Reg as he asked me to call him, was not so forthcoming with his tale, only that he vowed to end the lodge long before it found me. He and his brother Thackeray had apparently been investigating the mysterious building since childhood, but he would not reveal what led them on this quest. Having devoted their lives to this cause, he was certain that the lodge was somehow responsible for the disappearance of his brother, but he had no evidence to support this theory. Regardless of that fact, I had no doubt that he was absolutely right. With that in mind, though, I couldn't help but wonder why Mr. Thatch, the owner of the now-defunct back alley bookshop, was so unsettled by the Abernathy boys. If he was under the protection of the lodge, why work so hard to avoid them? Of course, I couldn't even hope to understand the outlook and methods of a seemingly sentient fucking cabin, let alone the motivations of those who worked for it. Once upon a time, I would have been entranced by this mystery, as I was about the lodge itself, but my curiosity wasn't running the show anymore. Though I still didn't exactly trust the wounded man on my couch, I offered to put him up for the night. Sure, by the time I showed him to the guest room, there wasn't much night left to speak of, but I was so exhausted that the sun rising outside my windows barely registered with me at the time. When I awoke the following afternoon to see no trace of the dark-haired man, I wasn't entirely surprised. While he hadn't gotten into what sort of help he was hoping I could provide in locating his missing brother, I had to assume that he decided to get back on his search alone. When I looked around in the guest room, it didn't even look as though the bed had been slept in. Of course, he could have simply tidied up after quietly slipping out of my home, but it still felt a little strange. Why would he come to me for help, only to bail without saying a word? Not to sound like an insensitive asshole or anything, but I was quite relieved, to be honest. I had enough already weighing down my heavy conscience as it was. The last thing I needed was another investigation in addition to the one I was hoping to leave behind. Shrugging off the whole ordeal, I began my daily rituals, getting myself showered and dressed to head back to the hospital to check in on Ted. As I headed to my front door, set to hop in the car, blasting the radio in an attempt to distract my scattered thoughts. My phone vibrating in my pocket inspired that all-too-familiar tension in my neck and back to return. My hand began to tremble as I stared down at yet another unknown number on my phone, my mind all over the place while deciding whether or not to answer. Quickly realizing that had I answered the call from Parker Chase when he attempted to contact me at the airport, I may have been able to prevent Ted from ending up so broken. I swiped my thumb across the screen, hesitantly raising the device to my ear.
Hi.
A light and gentle voice spoke from the other end of the line.
Is this Cameron?
It is, I replied, clearing the lump in my throat. Miss Morrison?
Betty.
She giggled.
Call me Betty. My brother told me that you came by the shop to see me. He said that you were asking about Simon?
Oh, yeah. I felt a stab in my chest, glancing to the wall, to where the painting was before I pulled it down and burned it. I love his work, and, I'd just like to know more about the guy, I suppose. We talked back and forth for a little while, the tension in my back easing more with every word she spoke. Before I knew it, we were laughing and flirting like a couple of teenagers. She didn't talk about her friend, but told me that she'd be happy to tell me everything she could, perhaps over dinner. She apparently had a busy couple of days ahead of her, so we set up a date for the coming Saturday. After we said our goodbyes, I found that the pit in my stomach had almost dissipated completely, replaced by a warm feeling in my chest, and a downright goofy grin plastered across my face. I was still wearing that grin over the drive to the hospital, but felt that lurching sensation returning as soon as I pulled into the parking lot. I sat in my car, staring down the building like a stalker in the night was gazing back at me through the window of my home. This had become something of a tradition that lasted longer with every visit to check on my friend. The first day I returned, having slept only a few hours back in my bed, I only hesitated for a few minutes. Whether it was due to the happiness I felt only moments before heading out, the meeting with Reginald Abernathy, or just the fact that this whole damn thing was taking a significant toll on me, it took me a solid 45 minutes to free myself from the confines of my car. I was slouching and skidding my feet like a kid being forced to take the garbage out before dinner as I strolled through the glass double doors. My mind was mostly vacant as I stepped into the elevator, my muscle memory bouncing my finger against the button to the 4th floor. I walked the familiar hallway that led to Ted's room, giving a complimentary nod to the officer talking to a nurse at the desk as I passed by. His name was Frank something, I think. One of Ted's colleagues I assumed was here for the same reason as I. I paid no mind to the veritably faceless people I passed by and weaved in between, still gazing vacantly before me. It wasn't until I reached the room in which Ted had been staying for the last few days, bandaged from head to toe and hooked to a variety of machines, that I found my wandering mind singularly focused once more. Had it not been for the fact that the stranger lying in the bed seemingly had the exact same injuries as my friend, I would be inclined to fear the worst. But when my eyes met the familiar face of the man who shared so many characteristics of the one who had slept in my guest room the previous night, I felt that head rush almost dropping me to the floor. I backed out of the room, fighting to remain upright, shaking my head from side to side in denial of what I couldn't pry my eyes away from. My ears were ringing from my loopy head, the gurgling in my stomach making me feel like I would retch any second. "Are you okay?" a friendly voice asked, as though calling out from the other end of the hallway. When I turned to see what I assumed to be a nurse, I lost my battle to remain upright. As blurry figures came up to where I now sat, from several directions, My senses betrayed me, fading into the black. I was still out of it when my eyes finally blinked back open. I was aware that I was lying on a surprisingly comfortable bed, but beyond that, I had no bloody idea what happened or where I was. When a familiar voice spoke from somewhere I was yet to register, I almost fell, careening back into the darkness. "You alright, man?" I couldn't even hope to form anything resembling rational words when I followed the direction of the voice. Instantly recognizing it, I fully expected to see its source, still bandaged from head to toe, but that was far from the case. I practically jumped, sitting up straight and damn near passing back out again from the head rush. "Whoa," Ted said, leaping from his seat to catch me before I tumbled head first. "Ted? How? What the?" He didn't have a mark on him. He was smiling, laughing at my acting so unhinged at the time, seeming fully unburdened by the things we had witnessed together, along with the all too obvious lack of the many injuries left in the wake of getting slammed in a fucking pissed-off door. "Calm down, Cam," he said, still chuckling under his breath. "Shit, man. What's got you so worked up?" I don't... What the hell? "I'm gonna get the doctor. Just lay back down, okay?" When Ted left the room, I did as he suggested, flopping back onto the bed, attempting to regulate my frenzied heartbeat. Yes, it was absolutely amazing to see him somehow back in one piece, but I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Between what sent me to the floor in the first place, the slightly shorter of the Abernathy boys having taken the place of my friend, and seeing Ted seemingly without a care in the world, I was beginning to feel like this was some surreal dream or something. The next hours went by in a blur, my mind still battling the fog that surrounded it. I had apparently been out for a while after hitting the floor. When the officer who was hanging out at the desk saw who I was, he placed the call to Ted, who had apparently been at his desk at the police station when I hit the floor. The more we talked, as my senses gradually recovered, I was reluctant to ask him the question burning in the back of my mind. How are you all fine and dandy while the dark-haired man now rests in your hospital bed? Hesitantly, I chose a less crazy-sounding inquiry. Did Parker Chase manage to get in touch with you? When Ted, furrowing his brow, simply replied, "Who?" I saw no need to bring up anything concerning the lodge. Had that damned building or the old shop owner somehow rewritten reality? If they could exchange his fate for another, what other alterations could they so easily make? Was I going completely fucking nuts? Could this entire ordeal be some sort of bizarre creation of my overly inventive mind? There were more questions than I could rationalize, each striking me one after the other, bleeding through my frenzied thoughts, like water spraying through a crack in a dam, joining with the riverbed below. After some hours spent in that hospital room, with a variety of tests being run on me at the request of my detective friend, they could find no medical cause for my having lost consciousness. Granted, I needed no explanation for why my head became so light and dizzy, but I knew there was no sense in getting into that with those who now showed no prior knowledge of the last lodge. Though I was relieved that Ted had somehow forgotten everything about the building, just as I hoped he would be able to not so long ago, I still couldn't even begin to wrap my mind around it. Whatever the case, though, he was free of this now, free of the burden of it all, and I was not about to drag him back into it. He was hesitant to allow me to get behind the wheel as we walked out of the hospital together, but I assured him I was feeling much better by that point, even if that was a crock of shit. When we arrived at my car, my erratic mind one part happy and the other part beyond freaked out, Ted asked me one more question I didn't know how to answer. "What were you doing at the hospital anyway?" "Oh, I was... Do you know the guy? The one in the room you passed out in front of?" "No, not exactly. I know his brother." "Then you know his name?" "I'm sorry, man. It's just that we haven't been able to ID him. He's been out since he was dropped off at the hospital." My mind was working overtime to figure out an excuse to get out of this conversation, or at least dismiss it in a way that would allow Ted to drop it. Ultimately, I ended up telling him a more colorful version of the truth of things, that I had met the Abernathy boys at the Blue Moon some weeks back. Having gotten to know them a bit, both of them being fans of my work, A hefty bag of bullshit that felt entirely self-promoting. Reginald reached out to me when his brother went missing. They had just moved into this town and didn't really know anyone else, so he ended up at my door. That's what led me to the hospital, to see if anyone fitting the description had ended up here. Upon seeing the condition of the man I had only recently met, I got overwhelmed and lightheaded. Unfortunately, having no contact information for Reginald, I could offer Ted no more than this, even if that was one of the few sprinklings of truth in my tale. My friend gave a strange look to my crock of shit, but he didn't push it. I could read it in his expression that he didn't know whether to believe me or not, but he thanked me for being able to identify the John Doe nonetheless. After that, he asked me to let him know if I heard from Reg as we bid our goodbyes. My thoughts were all over the place as I guided my car back to my home, barely able to focus on the road before me. A couple of missed intersections and a honking horn or three later, I pulled into my driveway, just glaring at the door to my house, fully expecting some random visitor to be awaiting me inside. After some time spent just gazing through my windshield, not unlike when I arrived at the hospital, I pried myself from the driver's seat, strolling to my door on trembling legs. I breathed in, exhaling a heavy, shaky breath as I pulled open the entrance to my home, my eyes cutting directly to my couch, to the familiar elderly man sitting upon it. He didn't speak, only gave me an acknowledging nod. I walked in, closing the door behind me, not taking my eyes off him as I strolled to the kitchen, snatching my 2 remaining beers off the shelf. Popping the cap off both of them, I sat one down in front of him before settling into my recliner. "How?" I asked, attempting to calm the shuddering in my voice.
"How is not important,"
he replied.
"Only that a mistake was undone."
It wasn't undone. You just swapped the victim. You had no right to bring Abernathy into this.
It was he who tied his own fate to the lodge, my boy. It was bound to react to their assault sooner or later. Think of this as a 2 birds with 1 stone scenario.
There was no arrogance in his voice as he spoke, only something of a solemn acceptance, as though this were a completely average situation. It was at this point, more than any other before, that I understood his role in all of this. He was not a victim of the lodge, nor its partner. He was a servant to it. I'm still not interested. I still won't enter, I said, not breaking my gaze from his.
And I am not here in an attempt to convince you otherwise, dear Cameron. Simply to illustrate my sincerity. To perhaps mend a bridge that may yet lead to further, negotiation.
I told you already. I want nothing to do with that damned building. He just gave me a smile and an accepting nod, glancing down at the bottle I sat before him.
"Much obliged,"
he said, picking it up, holding it beneath his nose, and then taking a drink.
Quite lovely, that. I haven't enjoyed a pint in many years.
So what now? I asked.
Now? Well, that remains to be seen,
he said, getting to his feet again.
If I may.
He held the bottle up, seemingly asking for permission to take it with him, wherever he may be headed. It's yours, I said with a shrug, getting up to walk him to the door. When I reached for the doorknob set to pull it open to lead him out, he wrapped his bony fingers around my wrist. Not aggressively, just a touch, just enough to halt my hand's approach.
"If you will allow me,"
he said, greeting my accusing stare with a mischievous smirk. He released his grip to reach into his pocket, retrieving a small brass key. I followed it, my eyes glued to the thin and liver-spotted hand as it slipped the key into the doorknob. I had a bad feeling where this was going. I still almost let the bottle fall from my grasp when he opened the door to reveal a red glow, with a very pleasant and strangely inviting lobby behind it, in place of the street which would normally be there. I felt it pulling me in again, my feet pacing me closer before I even realized it. As I felt my shoulder bump against that of the small and slender man as he pulled the key from the lock, I felt a hand on my chest, snapping my mind back to my more familiar world,
Not like this,
he said, still wearing that childlike grin.
Not until you are ready.
With that, he walked through the opening, reaching for something on the other side, just out of view. When he held out the parcel, I had no doubt it was wrapped within the beige paper. I was hesitant to accept it, but there was a bizarre sense of innocence behind the weathered eyes gazing back into mine.
It was always yours,
he said as I pulled the package from his hand.
And it will always find you.
I just glared back at him, the parcel in one hand and my bottle in the other.
Thank you,
he said, holding up the beer in his hand.
For this. I have very much missed it.
As he backed away from the door, that crimson glow enveloping him, I could vaguely make out several other figures in the shadows, feeling their eyes upon me. I felt both chilled and warm at the same time, part of my mind screaming for me to run, and the other begging me to follow the old man. But when the door slammed shut once more, I was left stunned, standing almost paralyzed in place. Moments later, after setting down the package on my coffee table, I pulled back open the door, seeing only the familiar sidewalk and road behind it. My body was still shivering all over, my thoughts scattered to the four winds. After cleaning my beer, absent-mindedly heading to my refrigerator for another it no longer held inside, the fog surrounding my brain began to ease, my stiff back settling down once more. Even after calming down my breathing and quickened pulse, I still just glared at the closed door, almost waiting for it to throw itself back open and drag me into the other place. Within the space of a few days, everything I thought I knew had shifted. I was both thrilled to have Ted freed from this damned curse, and heartbroken that I was alone in it once more. Sure, with him fighting for his life, as Thackeray Abernathy now did, I had nothing but regret and guilt to accompany my fear, but now I had absolute confusion to add to it. I felt awful for the shorter of the dark-haired brothers, but somewhere, deep down in places I wouldn't admit aloud, I was grateful for the exchange the last lodge had made. Over the following days, I did everything I could to distance my mind from this godforsaken mystery. I talked more with Ted over that time, enough to learn that he truly had no memory of the building, as well as the disappearance of Firenze Jones. While I hadn't built up the nerve to reach out to Parker Chase, his lack of any follow-up led me to believe that he too had been affected by the alterations. Though I had yet to decide whether or not to peel open the package that the elusive Mr. Thatch had gifted me as he crossed the threshold of my home into the depths of the mysterious lodge, I hadn't moved it from my coffee table. Perhaps I was just leaving it there as a reminder not to allow my guard to drop, even if it seemed I was free, at least for the time being. Maybe it was simply the fact that I had no doubt what was concealed behind the tan-colored paper. Whether or not I would ever be ready to walk willingly into that damn building, it would seem that I could not escape that book. I considered burning the wretched thing, parcel and all, but I had a feeling it wouldn't be long until yet another copy ended up in my hands. Logically, according to the numbers and boast under the cover of each copy I'd end up with, I would only have to burn 42 of the bloody things. But again, that was a real-world theory of things. Since Ted's still a perplexing rehabilitation, for lack of something better to call it, I could not deny that the lodge did not operate in any reality I was familiar with. With everything else going on, I had almost forgotten about my date with the lovely Miss Morrison. We hadn't spoken since the conversation we had before I left for the hospital some days back, and my mind had been otherwise distracted by everything else, even over the uneventful days that followed. When she sent me a text message on the morning of that Saturday, asking if we were still on for that night, I once more relocated a smile that felt so out of reach before. We messaged back and forth for a bit while I tried my damnedest to not come off like an overly excited teenager, arranging to meet at a local bar around sunset. It was one I had never heard of before, supposedly right on the outskirts of town. It was named the Border Between. It made sense given its location, right on the border where this town connected to the next. Perhaps it was that writer's mind again, but I often enjoy when businesses have such fitting titles, that little bit of extra creativity to things. After our text conversation came to a close, I let out a content sigh, feeling the tension in my neck and back replaced by a warm and downright giddy sensation. Betty was the one ray of positivity that had been constant since early in the investigation I hoped to be able to let go of once and for all. It was that very thought that allowed me to believe that I may actually make it through this with my sanity intact. That was until a few hours later, after trying on a variety of different outfits, battling between what would be considered overdressed or under, getting ready to head out in search of the bar I had never before heard of, when Betty sent another text message that almost halted my adrenaline-fueled pulse.
Weird request,
It read.
Bring the parcel the old man gave you, would you?
Once more my phone slipped out of my hand, my dizzy head almost dropping me beside it. How did she know about the package, or Mr. Thatch for that matter? Did this mean that she knew about the lodge as well? Was she, the woman I hoped to be the one person with whom I could escape the clutches of this damned place, be yet another servant to it? I replied to the message with these very questions, my hands trembling so violently that I had to retype them several times. All I received in response was a simple,
Trust me.
Once again, I could barely focus on the road as I drove to the outskirts of town. The questions kept piling up, each thought tumbling over the last, leaving my mind reeling from everything again. I was tempted to just turn my car around, driving in the other direction in the hopes of being able to outrun this entire ordeal. Somehow I knew there was no point in it. I knew that there was no escaping whatever fate lay ahead, making me feel more hopeless with every mile I traveled. Perhaps it didn't matter anymore. Maybe I'd been a prisoner since the beginning of all this. No matter which road I'd take, it would seem that all of them lead in the same direction. After driving for what felt like considerably longer than I would have thought, having left my little town behind, traversing many miles of deserted road, I saw one building off in the distance. I pulled into the large parking lot with a scattering of vehicles here and there, in front of the large wooden building. Immediately, I could not deny the similarities in style and dimension to the very cabin I hoped to escape. I could see silhouetted figures through the foggy glass windows, but no crimson aura bleeding through. That was something, at least. The neon sign perched upon the roof of the place reading "The Border Between" flickered with a vibrant green glow. While I was hesitant at best, I felt a strange sort of welcoming sensation as I cut off my engine and climbed out of my car, pulling the parcel from my passenger seat. I was in something of a daze as I wandered closer to the entrance, with the "Open All Hours" sign mounted to the door. I pulled open the door, unleashing a warm, amber light from within, spilling my shadow behind me. Of the several people inside, I only registered the beautiful smile of the woman I was there to see, spinning on her bar stool to look my way. Stepping over the threshold, I felt the most peculiar sensation, like someone behind me was grabbing my wrist to pull me back. When I turned to see the hand that held the package somehow locked in midair, like it was trapped between the outside world and the inviting aura inside, I couldn't even wrap my mind around what was happening. I pulled at my wrist, unable to drag myself fully into the bar. I hadn't even noticed that my pulse had regulated until it began to race once more as I yanked at the hand that could not pass through the entryway.
I should have told you,
a light and familiar voice said, with slender fingers weaving between mine.
You can't bring that in here.
Betty took me by the hand that made it into the bar, leading me back outside. Again, I had so many questions, but I couldn't form them into words at the time. I just gazed into her big brown eyes as we strolled hand in hand across the parking lot, feeling my heartbeat both settle down and race a little for a very different reason.
It'll all make sense soon enough,
she said, smiling back at me.
Well, kinda, I suppose.
When we got back to my car, she slipped her fingers from mine, cutting her eyes to the parcel in my hand.
Go ahead and open it.
Without a word, I tore into the paper, peeling it away from the all-too-familiar cover. While I was still somewhat distracted by the company of the enchanting brunette, I couldn't help but notice how flawless this copy of the book was. No scratches or blemishes in sight, only the smooth texture and brilliant, almost glowing red of the image that even my dreams could not escape. I looked back up at Betty, who tilted her head back to the book held in my trembling hands. Almost instinctively, I pulled open the cover, my eyes instantly drawn to the numbers etched inside. 1 of 42. It wasn't until I closed the book again that I noticed something I hadn't before, something that had not been present on any other copy I had seen so far, something that left my jaw hanging loose, dropping me back to my knees. "The Lodge is waiting" was written in bold text at the top of the cover, just as had been the case with all the others. But at the bottom, right under where the mist crept between the trees and through the sparse greenery, was the author's name. Cameron McConnell. My name. What? I stuttered, glancing back into those big brown eyes.
Not yet,
she said, cupping the side of my face with her warm hand. At her request, after I relearned how to form a legible sentence, I put the book back in my car, and she led me into the bar, the tall and slender bartender sliding me a fresh and chilled pint. I didn't question why I was able to enter this time, though it wasn't hard to figure out what was preventing it before. With my mind still all over the place, Betty explained that this bar was something of a sanctuary, a place in which nothing lodge-related could enter. It seemed a bit hard to believe, but I had long since abandoned rational thinking when it came to this mystery. I sat in silence while my date spoke. While she, personally, hadn't had any first-hand experience with the lodge, it was her friend Simon Dorian who fell prey to its will, something I knew already, or suspected at least. It was at that point, as I felt the other set of eyes upon me, while I gazed blankly at my second pint, when I glanced up to meet the kind, smiling face of the bartender, having paid him little attention beforehand. "How?" I asked, for the second time this week, gazing into the eyes of the man with the dark, shoulder-length hair, who wore a strangely understanding, crooked smile. "It was the only way," he said, refilling my glass. "The only way I could escape it." I cut my eyes to Betty, who smiled at her friend behind the counter, looking back at me with a shrug. While the man looked several years older than he did in the slightly out-of-focus image on the driver's license that Ted pulled up, it was most definitely the same man. Between whatever experience he had with the lodge, along with his supposed suicide, it's a wonder the whole ordeal hadn't aged him more. "It was her idea," Dorian said with a light chuckle. "But the lodge can't claim a dead man." According to the story Simon shared with me that night, he too had encountered an emissary of the lodge some months before his own sanity began to crumble. A middle-aged, quite beautiful woman with vibrant red hair, named Dolores Crawford, who ran an art gallery in Manhattan, reached out to him about some of his paintings she was interested in displaying. Though she seemed friendly enough in their first meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that she did not have the purest of motivations. Given the fact that they had spoken on the phone before she supposedly flew out to meet him, a conversation that raised not the first red flag, he allowed his uneasy feelings about her to take a back seat in favor of this potential opportunity. He assumed that the wealthy gallery owners of the world would maintain a certain degree of superiority when speaking with the lower life forms, so he just chalked his apprehensions up to that. When she brought him out to visit her gallery, however, something began to shift in his mental state. He appeared quite troubled and somewhat distant while he attempted to recall exactly what it was about the place that set some sort of seed in his mind, but all he could recall were the crimson walls lining the interior of the building. He struggled to remember any of the paintings and sculptures he gazed upon within, but the look in his eyes as he peered into his subconscious seemed more akin to some level of PTSD than memories of elegant art. By the time he returned to his home, he found himself driven to trace something different upon the canvas, the very painting I had only recently burned to ash. When he stepped back to look upon this imagery, his mind having almost been in a trance during the hours he spent crafting it, he felt it pulling him in, as though reaching out its tendrils from within the haunting cabin. Had it not been for the intervention of his girlfriend, Penelope, shaking him back to awareness after returning home from work, he feared he would have been dragged through the door he had painted, as though he had created a portal, rather than a two-dimensional piece of art. Over the weeks that followed, he grew more distant from the world around him, almost violently etching more and more disturbing works into the canvas. Oftentimes, what he produced was barely recognizable, though his girlfriend found the imagery downright unsettling to her senses. Penelope reached out to Betty, hopeful that she could get through to him, being the one who knew him better than anyone. It took several weeks, a lot of patience, and a great deal of work, but she and his fiancée both managed to pull him back to his senses after loading him in the car and driving far away from the home he had not set foot out of in months. The three of them spent some days out of town, avoiding it as though the plague had begun to run rampant, but as they reluctantly made that return trip in the middle of a rainy night, Dorian caught sight of a subtle glow in the distance. He couldn't fully illustrate what it was about the building they drew closer to that made him so desperate to enter, but he became frantic as he begged Betty to pull over. At first, she feared this was another aspect to the madness they were attempting to break him free of, but as this bar, came into view, she felt it too, that this place was a haven, and not some place to fear.
"The second I walked through that door,"
Simon said, nodding to the entrance,
"I felt lighter than I had in months. Like the burden I'd carried for so long, so much longer than I even realized had been pulled off my shoulders."
It was within these very walls that they devised their plan to free Dorian from the grasp of the lodge, though he still didn't fully understand what it was that had dragged him to the brink of madness at the time. They would have to make it look believable, so believable that even whatever otherworldly consciousness glared out from that sinister cabin would believe it. This bar, granting sanctuary to many victims of the lodge worldwide, people in many different professions, it made things a lot easier to get their hands on a convincing enough corpse to fit the bill. With the aid of some of the many, far more experienced residents of the place, Simon Dorian, for all intents and purposes, died on October 17th, 2022, and has not left this bar since. Given that the place looked no bigger than any average tavern I had entered over the years, I can help but wonder how any number of people could be hidden away within these walls. Of course, that was not the main concern I had at the time. All that was on my mind when Dorian's story came to a close was, "Can you help me too?" Betty and Simon looked at one another, while my heart was beating at a far more hastened rate than the average day. When my date laid her hand on my leg, gazing into my eyes with a sorrowful expression, I felt my still racing heart drop to the pit of my stomach.
"It's not that simple. Not with you,"
she said, cutting her eyes to the window.
"That book. You wrote that, Cameron."
"No, I didn't. I never looked at that fucking book until I got dragged into this bullshit. I don't know."
"But you will. You did. You can't change that."
"That doesn't make any fucking sense," I said, getting to my feet with my anger boiling over. "Why even bring me here if—"
"You can't alter what has already happened, Cam. Even if it's in your future, it's history for everyone else. Cameron, you have to enter the lodge."
I just stared at her, feeling an overwhelming sense of betrayal. I just turned on the spot, making my way to the door to leave this damned bar behind, just as I hoped to escape the lodge itself. Betty grabbed my arm, but I just shook her off, ignoring the pleading voices behind me. By the time I reached the door, pushing it open to allow the chilly night air to breathe into my lungs, I had already decided to burn every copy of that damned book that fell into my possession. That was, until another voice I could not ignore spoke from behind me.
"You don't need to enter to get locked away with everyone else in there."
I stopped in my tracks, the familiar time-worn voice almost immediately halting my hastened pulse.
"You need to enter to set them all free,"
the man said, laying a weathered and wrinkled hand on my shoulder. When I hesitantly turned around, though I had no doubt who would be standing there, the sight of Randolph Jones, alive and well, caused my head to become so light I couldn't remain standing anymore. Once again, I found my consciousness wavering as I lay on the hard floor, the blurry image of two dead men and a gorgeous brunette, the last thing I saw before falling into the black again. When I awoke in yet another unfamiliar place, I found myself alone in a dimly lit room. The bed I was propped upon felt cozy enough, but between the pounding in my head, the muffled voices coming from the next room, and the realization that there wasn't a single person I could trust anymore, I was not about to just settle in for the night. The room I occupied at the time looked to be some sort of garden variety bedroom. Without taking the time to allow my mind to wander, investigating whether I was still in the bar or some house to which they had carried me while I slept, I got to my feet, scanning my surroundings for a way out. There was one window on the left side of the room, one that appeared more akin to a home than a random bar off the highway. Though I was mostly surrounded by darkness, I gently crept to my hopeful exit, keeping each footfall as soft and hesitant as I could, not allowing my guard to drop for a second, regardless of my foggy brain still hung over from my involuntary slumber. Peering through the glass, I could see that I was on the ground floor of whatever building I was in. When my trembling fingers flipped the clasp of the window, sliding it up as silently as I could, I gave one final glance to the door at the front of the room, assuring myself that those on the other side were still preoccupied with their conversation. To my surprise, not only did I clear the exit without being discovered, but I was indeed standing outside the very bar to which I had been lured under false pretenses. It didn't appear any larger than it looked from the road, but I had a feeling the bedroom in which I awoke was only one of many, somehow tucked away within the place. Though I was momentarily perplexed by this, I had no time to waste lingering on the bizarre nature of the unusual buildings I had encountered of late. My only goal at the time was reaching my car and speeding away from both this bar and this town. I snuck around the side, my eyes fixed on my vehicle when it came back into view. I had no idea what time it was, nor if any of those within these walls may be casually gazing through the windows, but again, I didn't need to drag my heels if I hoped to escape. When I reached the front corner of the building, keeping myself hidden beneath the windows, I tried to calm my erratic breathing and quicken pulse. I tucked my hand into my pocket, letting out a sigh of relief when my fingers wrapped around my keys. With my key fob in hand, I took one final deep breath and ran to my car without looking back. The second I reached my door, slinging it open and almost tumbling into my driver's seat, I heard the door to the bar creaking. I cranked my engine, refusing to allow my eyes to meet those who ran across the parking lot, screaming for me to wait. As I pushed my pedal to the floor, squealing the tires as I tore back onto the highway, I gave one final glimpse to the lovely Miss Betty Morrison, who looked at me through teary and hurt-filled eyes. I just shook my head, gunning it away from those who saw fit to feed me to the lodge, heading back to my home to pack my bags as quickly as I could. Every set of headlights I saw in the rear view convinced me that I was being followed, so I made a mental inventory of everything I needed to grab before I left my home in the dust. When I arrived, I sprinted inside, not so much as allowing myself to fear any visitors who may have let themselves in while I was away. I had 2 suitcases filled within minutes, tossing them into my trunk and tearing away from what was once my sanctuary. I didn't know where I was headed, nor did I care at the time. I had to distance myself from everyone and everything, no matter where it may lead me. It seemed that everybody had an agenda for me, their own motivations for pushing me towards a common goal. Was there anyone who didn't want me to enter that godforsaken lodge? Did one person give 2 shits about what happened to me in the long run? I will not be pushed and pulled anymore, no matter how far I have to run to escape this madness. This is my life, and I will not allow my destination to be picked for me. They can all find another pawn in their ridiculous schemes. I'm no one's fucking puppet. I'm pulling my own strings now.